So happy Wednesday again. We are here today on this lovely, or maybe not so lovely, it's real rainy here, Wednesday morning to talk about oral communications for English 1 through 4. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump on in and get us started. If I can get this going. There we go. All right, so we'll start with some housekeeping. Um, First, with some introductions, I see a lot of familiar faces and some familiar names in the group, but for those of you who have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Casey Prince Harvey. I am here to support your work with ELA for high school. And with me, I have my two awesome ELA colleagues. I have Mandy Hawker, who is our elementary ELA education associate. We are all in the Office of Assessment and Standards. We're on the standards side. And then Brenna McCormick, who is our middle level ELA education associate. So we are your ELA team here to support your work with the ELA standards and to provide any sort of support that we can with your planning and instruction. Um, you will have a resource that will drop in the chat. That is going to be a note catcher, which will also serve as your landing page. So as we go through today's slides, you'll see that periodically there will be a slide with a number in the corner. So that number is going to correspond to a box on your note catcher. And in addition, some of those boxes on the note catcher will have links to resources that we'll be referring to. So that's going to be your one-stop shop for everything. So you want to make sure you click that link that Brenna has dropped in the chat because as we go through, that's what you'll be referring to. Additionally, we will be utilizing some breakout rooms because this is a small group. This will be more of like a partner opportunity. So we may have groups of 2 or maybe a couple with 3, just depending, where you will talk through some resources, accomplish some tasks together, reflect on some learning, and share some resources. So when we do jump to those, and we'll have 2 opportunities for them, you want to make sure that you're just engaged as best as possible. I know that for some of you, you've got lots of things going on right now, but just try to utilize that time as best you can. And then high quality instructional materials. So today we will be talking about some resources, some strategies, and some supports that we'll share throughout the presentation. And just as a reminder, those resources are in addition and meant to support your high quality instructional materials, so your textbook adoptions. In addition, when we do one of our breakouts a little bit later, we'll be looking at some sample lessons from those high quality instructional materials. So we'll have examples from all grade levels, English 1 through 4, and from all 3 of the material adoption. So whether you had SAVIS, HMH, or McGraw-Hill Study Sync, there will be something within those resources for you to take a look at a little bit later today. All right. Little bit of a reminder here that we are offering recertification credit for each hour of webinar participation for our fall webinars. In order to receive that recertification credit, we have 3 requirements. Those are attending the live webinar and being an active participant, remaining in attendance for the duration of the webinar, and then completing the feedback form that we will have at the end. So that just is that final check to make sure that that you were here, that you participated, and then we usually send those certificates within about a week. So around the time that we will send the recording and the resources to you, if you have completed all of those criteria, you will also receive your recertification certificate from us. All right, that was a lot of housekeeping. We'll go ahead and jump into our purpose for today. And it's a little bit of a long one, so bear with me here. The purpose of today is to understand the content and rigor expectations of oral communications for high school students in order to develop and provide standards-based instruction using high-quality instructional materials and evidence-based strategies. So what you see here is a lot of educator lingo, right? It's real word salady. And you see that there is a number on this slide. So this slide is going to correspond with box 1 of your note catcher. And what I want us to do is take a moment to deconstruct this statement. What are the verbs? What are the nouns? And in your own words on your note catcher, what do you think that you should be able to do when you're finished with today's session? So if today is a success, if we meet this purpose, what do you think that you should be able to do? Take about 2 minutes to jot down your thoughts on your note catcher, and then I'll ask for you to share some of your responses in the chat. So at about 10:10, I'll have you drop some of your responses in the chat. All right. Take a moment to drop any of your thinking into the chat. In your own words, what do you think you should be able to do when we are finished with today's session? If today were a success, what do you think you will be able to walk away with, knowing, or doing? All right, I see Emily be able to design standards-based instruction and activities at the appropriate level of rigor that align with the standards, create and deliver standards-based lessons using evidence-based strategies, provide the standards-based instruction using HQIM and evidence-based. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So each of those pieces we will hit on today. Understanding the intent of our indicators for oral communications, talking about those evidence-based strategies, some activities and lessons to support those, and then aligning that to your high-quality instructional materials in a way that is intentional and authentic. Wonderful. So that is going to lead us into our first quote. And y'all, if you've been with me, you know that I love a quote. I love to think about a quote. Every high school English teacher that I know likes to ponder when it comes to quotes, and they like to use that to tie into whatever it is that we're talking about. So we're going to do a little bit of a consider this, and I'll start with a quote. Um, and it is a quote from James Britton, and it says, "Reading and writing float on a sea of talk." And I want you to tell me in the chat what your initial thoughts are on this quote. Does this align with your thinking? How do you see this in instruction? Is it something that maybe you don't see in instruction or would like to see in instruction? Just tell me what your initial thoughts are on James Britton's quote, "Reading and writing float on a sea of talk." You can just drop it in the chat. Let's see. Notice that discussion and conversations are requirements for reading and writing, just like something can't float without water, skills can't work without the discussion. Yes. Collaborative discussion as an integral part of the reading and writing process. Communication is key in reading and writing. Um, aligns with your thinking in the sense that talking is the first step in high quality reading and writing. Yes, absolutely. So, one thing that we will talk about today, one important idea that we'll discuss throughout today's session is that oral communication is not only an integral component of your language arts instruction, but it's a major support for both that reading and writing. So when we talk about our oral communications and what the intent is, not only do we want to understand that intent, but also how it's going to support that reading and writing to elevate that understanding and then to elevate that output um, to intentionally bundle those indicators together. I'm just taking a look at some of the other responses. Oral communication is the foundation for reading and writing to occur. Yes. There's a reason that it's a part of our standards, right? It is a major building block in our language arts instruction. All right. So that's going to take us to our agenda. We will briefly have an overview of oral communications at sort of the larger level, where oral communications fit in, what the general expectation is within the standards. We'll then move into exploring the individual grade level expectations and understanding that indicator intent, followed by some instructional practices and collaboration, and then finishing up with some clarity and closure. So let's go ahead and jump on into our overview of oral communications. We're going to start with an article. And on your note catcher, in box 2, you will see that there are 2 different articles that you can choose from. They're just quick reads. We're not going to take a ton of time, but just enough time for you to dive into that article, whichever of the 2 that you choose. And on your note catcher, box 2, you'll see that there is a place for you to choose one statement from whichever article it is that you choose. You're going to reflect on your statement, either making a connection, asking a question. Think about a statement that you might challenge, maybe. Maybe there's something in there that you're like, I don't know that that aligns with my thinking, or an aha moment. And then you're going to explain your thinking in the last column. So for this, we'll take about 5 minutes for you to skim and scan that article, choose your statement, and then reflect on it. Okay. So let's see what takeaways you had from your quick skim and scan of the article. We had 2 articles to choose from. We had one that was adapted from the Build Your Expertise blog series on oral communications. Then we had from Literacy Today, we had What Kind of Talk? And let's see. Okay, so Elizabeth, I see you read Article 1, talking about exploratory talk versus presentational talk, and both of those being essential components, right? Exploratory being sort of the in real time, authentic discussion experience where students really get to process their understanding, and then presentational talk, which is really the polished kind of final form. And we have space for both within our standards, which is really exciting. So I can't wait to talk about that. Let's see. If students are not utilizing rich talk, they're not able to create those thoughts that are critical to the learning process. Yeah. So having those rich talk experiences. Yes, that these are opportunities for students to have ownership of their thinking. Vivian, I see you mentioned that. Develop their own connection and meaning to content, right? This is how they get to really dig in and make meaning. I don't know if anyone took a look at the other article, the oral language one, talks about some of the research, and in some cases lack of research on oral communication and how it supports writing. That there is research to support that oral communication can benefit and support your writing, but that in some classes, let me see. Observations in 41 classrooms over a semester found no time dedicated to oral storytelling despite its correlation to narrative structure. So, in some cases, these opportunities for oral communication aren't necessarily there. And one thing that was mentioned is that may not be surprising because oral communications is not something that we see on a standardized test necessarily. So we might be focusing a little bit more time on the reading and writing and a little bit less on the oral communication. But I don't know about you, um, but teaching in 2020, 2021 virtually, and then students coming back, oral communications were an area that I saw my students lacking because they didn't have as much of that in-person collaborative opportunity. So when they came back, that was something that that I saw as a need for my students. And as many of you said in your reflections on Article 1, it helps them to process that information that they're gathering in the reading and to prepare that understanding for the writing. So really supporting that it is integral to the instruction within a language arts classroom. Um, Now thinking about that, and I'm seeing so many great responses in the chat. I need to like I'm trying to like look at the slides, but then also come back to these. Thinking about that, we know that communication in general is integral to our profile of the South Carolina graduate. If you attended any of our writing sessions that we held over the summer and a little bit into the fall, we talk about this profile a lot because, especially at the high school level, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? This is like we are preparing them for this. This is what we should start to see taking shape and forming as they are preparing to leave the high school setting. So these skills are so important. And I want you to take a quick look at this and consider, and you can jot this in box 3 of your note catcher, or you can drop it in the chat. How do oral communications support students' success in college, career, or military? How does it support these skills that we see in the profile? Where do we see those things aligning? For students to be able to have discussions with one another, to be able to have some of that presentational experience as well. Where do we see that within the profile? Ooh, teamwork, right. Absolutely. Yeah, communication. You have to be able to have conversations with other people. Um, and yes, helpful with the collaboration and teamwork. Absolutely, Joy, critical thinking and problem solving. Um, and being able to adapt communication in real time too. That is tricky. Absolutely. Knowing how to learn since conversation is a part of that learning process. Yes, yes. Um, so absolutely, it's in multiple places, right, within our profile. Yes, Sandra, communication skills for multiple jobs and careers, working with others. I can't think of a single job where you don't have to communicate with someone. And that could be written, that could be oral communication. Probably is going to be some combination of both. Yes. You may have to share or present information in different ways. Um, and that could be college, that could be career, that could in any and all, right? So having those skills and knowing how to adapt them for those different tasks, purposes, and audiences is essential for sure. So not only do we see that supported throughout the profile, but we see it in our overarching expectations as well. So as you know, our 2024 ELA standards have 6 overarching expectations, and these are just what we call the business of ELA. This is just what ELA looks like on a daily basis across grade levels, across grade bands. These are just the things that, you know, aren't necessarily standards or indicators. They're going to support multiple strand standards and indicators. So we see oral communications pretty clearly in overarching expectation 4, collaborating with others and using active listening skills. But could we also see oral communications addressed in some of the other overarching expectations? And if so, where? Are there some some clear connections that we can make where oral communications might support those overarching expectations or be supported by the overarching expectations. 2, yes, acquire, refine, and share knowledge because you may be doing that in a written format. You may be doing that through a collaborative discussion. You may be doing that in that presentational communication where you're having to create a polished product. And that also supports that overarching expectation 6, right? Creating quality work, adhering to an accepted format. That format may be some sort of presentation. Yes, Elizabeth, 3, you make inferences verbally within group discussions. Yes, yes. So we see it everywhere. And so we just want to talk today about how we can fine tune, yes, overarching expectation 5, citing evidence. If I'm having a conversation with someone and I really need to support my point, I want to have evidence to back that up. And I want it to be something that really justifies what I have to say, right? And that it's credible for sure. So, we are talking about our 2024 South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards. We are focusing in on written and oral communications, which is that 4th strand that we typically just call communications. Within that, we have 9 standards and 9 indicators. 3 of those, which are C7, C8, and C9, are going to be our standards that address oral communications. We do have webinars on the first 5 standards within this strand. So our standards that address argumentative writing, informative writing, narrative writing, grammar and conventions, and improving writing. We have webinars on all of those that we did over the summer. And those will be on that professional learning library. So if you want to go back and see anything else that we talked about in terms of written and oral communications, you can find that there. But for today, we're focusing on those last 3 standards within this strand that address oral communications. So we do have 3 standards for oral communications. We have C7, so communicating ideas, collaboration and perspective, which is C8, and then evaluating ideas, C9. And I do have a spot in your note catcher for you to reflect on these as we look at the overall expectation. So what I'm going to pull up is just the end of learning expectation. So by the time students are preparing for graduation, these will be the expectation. And then we'll move into the grade level indicators in just a moment. So I want you to consider what these mean and what they look like. So consider your own experience, consider how you might interpret it within the language of the indicator, or if you've already done a dive into your instructional materials, what do they look like there? So C7, the expectation for end of learning, like end of English 4, is for students to organize and communicate ideas through a range of formats to engage a variety of audiences. So I want to pause there. What does that mean? What does it look like? At the high school level, what does it look like for students to organize and communicate their ideas through a range of formats to engage a variety of audiences? When I look at this, I think of what was mentioned in Article 1, so that presentational communication, right? This is more of what seems to be that more formal, more polished presentation of ideas, and one that might be adjusted to meet different audiences or different purposes, right? We might have to adapt whatever that presentation of ideas is. C8, we have collaboration and perspective. So through collaboration, react and respond to information while building upon the ideas of others and respecting diverse perspectives. So again, what does that mean and what does that look like? In a high school classroom, what could that be? What does it look like? What does it sound like? And then lastly, C9, evaluating ideas. Ooh, April, yes, presenting research, writing a research proposal, working in collaborative groups to design a research presentation for sure. Yeah. Evaluating ideas is a little bit different. It asks students to evaluate and critique ideas and concepts interactively through listening and speaking. So this one's going to be a little bit different because it's really students evaluating the work of others, right? And when we get into those grade level expectations, we will see some specifics on that. All right. Collaborative conversation. Yeah, peer review. Yes, yes. Um, and even your more informal discussions, right? Your think, pair, shares, right? Any of those that could be at a macro level to a micro level, students having conversations with one another, and being able to respond, being able to build off of one another, and of course, to respect the diverse perspectives, which means I might not agree with you, right? But I can respect your viewpoint. I can respect your perspective on that topic. All right, so we've explored generally the ways in which oral communications support the reading and writing, like from that one of those articles. We looked at the general expectation, the overall expectation, it would be better to say, within the standards. So I want us to take a moment here to consider practical application, which you've already started to do in the chat. And we're going to do that through the grade level entrance statements. So if you have done a dive into the standards document, you know that each grade level starts with a grade level entrance statement, and it's going to provide an overview of learning at each of those grade levels, and it's going to include examples of reading, research, and writing that a student might engage in at that level. They provide a starting point for instruction, but they're not necessarily meant to be prescriptive, right? It's just, here's what English 1 will look like generally. And we often use these to build out long-range plans. You can add them to your syllabus, share with parents, lots of different ways that you can use them. But what I want us to consider when we look at the grade level entrance statements, let me click, hold on. There we go. And actually, let me go back. First, I'm going to have you pick one of the grade level entrance statements to look at. So in the chat, Brenna has dropped the English 1 through 4 grade level entrance statements. They're all like on one document. And I want you to just pick one grade level entrance statement to look at for the grade level that you serve. And if you serve more than one grade, as many of us do, just pick your favorite. From this, we are going to do a little bit of a virtual turn and talk. So what we're going to do is once you read over that entrance statement for that grade level, step 1 will be to respond to the prompt that I will put on the screen in just a moment. So you're going to drop that in the chat, whatever your response is to it. Step 2 is after you've done that, you're going to go back up through the chat, and I want you to react or reply to one other person's post. Okay, so it's a virtual version of a turn and talk. So you'll respond or reply or react to someone else's post. So as you look at the grade level entrance statement for whichever one that you choose, I want you to think about how the expectations for oral communication, so students presenting ideas, collaborating with one another, or evaluating the ideas of others, could enhance the reading and writing that you see at that level in the grade level entrance statement. So it's going to give you some ideas for reading, writing, and research. I want you to think about how the expectations for oral communications could enhance what you see there. Okay, I am seeing some ideas dropped into the chat already. So remember, step 2, once you drop your post in the chat, I want you to go back up and either react or reply to another person's post. So I threw in my own example with English 2, because English 2 is my baby. That was my favorite to teach every single year. And in the grade level entrance statement, it mentions advertisements as one of the types of text that students might read. And that got me thinking about that C9 where they're evaluating the ideas of others, that they could do that through commercials or video advertisements, social media campaigns and posts. So I'm just taking a look. And again, you just want to go back up to one other person's post and either react or respond for the step 2. Okay, I'm seeing some really great ideas. Vivian, you mentioned tone and having students do peer review with a partner where they read the writing aloud to listen and evaluate for that tone. Angie mentioned students discussing a reading or writing assignment, discuss open-ended questions related to the indicators before they respond in the writing. So they get that opportunity to maybe make that meaning with a partner or peer or group before they have to craft the response. Elizabeth, I love what you said about building in those oral communications around that reading and writing might help students to feel like maybe there's a little bit of a judgment-free zone. Because a lot of times when we think of oral communications, we think of a formal presentation and it has to be perfect and polished. But having those discussions right there in real time where you're still figuring things out and working through them in an exploratory fashion might make them feel a little bit more comfortable. Yes. Let's see. I'm seeing a lot of mention of peer feedback. I love that idea. Um, let's see. So really that focus on tone and style. And we see that, also in the presentation for oral communications. If students are creating or building presentations and sharing them with an audience as they move through the grade levels, they focus a little bit more on, yes, style and those intentional and appropriate choices for whatever the task, purpose, and audience are. All right, so our virtual turn and talk aligns to one of the standards that we just reviewed, and that would be C8, right? So to do a virtual turn and talk would allow students to, through collaboration, react and respond to information while building upon the ideas of others and respecting those diverse perspectives, right? So this is an activity that you could take and use that would align to that standard. If we were doing this in a and we can still say that it supports overarching expectation 4, but if we did it in real time together in one space where you were verbally communicating with one another, it would also support that overarching expectation 4, which is to collaborate with others, which we've done, and use those active listening skills. Okay, so that was a very general overview of oral communications, but I want us to go ahead and jump into the grade level expectations and understanding our indicator intent. And we're going to do that through our vertical progressions. So if you've been with us for other webinars, we use these all the time. They're a really incredible and powerful tool because they're going to give you the K through English 4 progression for each standard and indicator. So we see where an indicator is introduced in kindergarten, for example, and then how it extends and changes over time to get to that English 4 end of learning expectation. We also notice that new content or skills in the vertical progression are in bold. So if we see terms that are in bold in certain areas, that lets us know that that's the first time that students are going to encounter that language or that expectation for that particular standard. So we're going to use these to do a little bit of a grade level breakdown. And this is where we're going to hop into your first breakout room. So I'm going to explain everything, I'm going to show an example, and then I'll have you pop out to a breakout room. So we talked about the general expectation, sort of the end of learning expectation for C7, C8, and C9. Sandra, I'm so glad you love the vertical progression document. It's one of our favorite things to talk about. We love to use it in professional learning. It's just so powerful. But you've talked about the general expectation. We know C7 is going to be the presenting of ideas, communicating ideas. C8 is going to be that collaboration. C9 is going to be evaluating the ideas of others. But I want us to see what that looks like at the individual grade level. So we'll do a grade level breakdown, and you have box 5 of your note catcher to jot down your thinking around this. So we're going to think about the needs, the guarantees, the key terms, and then the impacts on planning and instruction. And you're going to do this with just one of those standards, and it'll be a grade level of your group's choice. So in other words, we're going to pop you out to a breakout room, and your breakout room will be C7, C8, or C9. You'll choose which grade level you want to look at for that particular standard. Okay, so you're going to focus in just on the grade level indicator for whichever of those standards you got popped out to. Does that make sense? Can I get a thumbs up? We got that part down? Okay. So when we think about the needs and guarantees, that's going to be first for needs, what skills or content will students need to be successful at this grade? As in, what should they be coming to us with? That's where, when you look at that vertical progression, which Brenna's dropped in the chat, and it should be on your landing or your note catcher as well, you want to look at the grade levels that come before your grade. So what are the things that they have learned to get them to what the expectation is for your grade level? Then for the guarantees will be what skills or content will students leave this grade with. So that's where you really want to look at your grade level expectation. What are the skills? What are the content that you know students can leave with to support that next grade? Key terms will be what language will students need to be successful at this level, or what terms are defined in the glossary. So we have many of those words that are in bold are also defined in our glossary. But I want you to consider what language students may have acquired from the previous grade levels, or where there might be new language at the level that you chose. Okay, so that's where you want to write down any key terms that you think will be important for students to know. And then lastly would be impacts on planning and instruction. So what would be important for teachers to know if you picked English 1 and you got popped into the C7 room, what would be important for English 1 teachers to know if they are instructing or planning for instruction around C7? What could student success look like? So what might students do to demonstrate their mastery? Or how might teachers formatively assess that learning? So I've got an example here from 8th grade where I chose C9. Let's say I got popped out into the C9 room. In this case, I'm using 8th grade. So my needs would be from previous levels that students will need to determine the effectiveness of a speaker's argument. They'll need to determine the relevance of the evidence that's presented by that speaker. They'll analyze the speaker's choices. So how did they choose to present the information? What's the format, what's the style, and then analyze the purpose of the information. So what's the why behind it? Why did they choose that information to share with their audience? So that's everything that comes before. When I think about what students will leave with, once they leave 8th grade with C9, they'll be able to evaluate a speaker's reasoning. They'll determine how the speaker addresses misconceptions or objections. So how might the speaker address misconceptions around whatever it is they're presenting, or objections? For key terms, I'm pulling some key terms from previous levels like argument, claim, and evidence, relevance, reasoning, misconceptions, and objections, because those are going to be new at that level, and then style. And then for planning and instruction, I probably want to review the types of reasoning. So they would have seen those in previous levels and with some other standards. So I might want to go back and talk about what the different types of reasoning are. I might want to also think about how misconceptions or objections relate to counterclaims in writing, because at 8th grade, students are already acknowledging and refuting counterclaims when they write arguments. So how might that be similar to them looking at the misconceptions or objections that a speaker addresses? And then I want to maybe collect a variety of presentation formats and styles so that they see the different ways that speakers might choose to present their information, and maybe collaborate with some colleagues to get some ideas for those things, or even some ideas for some topics. So that would be how I might do a breakdown for 8th grade for C9.1. But anyway, you are going to go hop to a breakout room. You will see in the top right corner, it should say C7, C8, C9 to let you know which standard you're working with. From there, you and your partners are going to pick whichever grade level you want to do the breakdown for, and then you can just jot it in your note catcher in box 5. That's to talk through some of the information on the grade level breakdown. I know about 10 minutes is not enough time to do the whole thing and maybe hit the depth that you wanted to, but now you maybe have an idea of something that you might take and do a deeper dive into later, or maybe bring to your PLC group or your department and have some conversations around. But in the midst of all of those great conversations, I picked up on a couple of things, but I would love to hear what some of your takeaways were. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe dropping in the chat a takeaway. Maybe it was something with the needs, the guarantees, maybe key terms for your level, or impacts on planning and instruction. And just make sure you put whether it was C7, C8, or C9 that you were looking at. Or if you would rather unmute, I mean, we're a small group. If you want to unmute and just share verbally, you can do that as well. I'd just love to hear what you talked about.
Our group had C 7.1,
Mm-hmm.
and we had great conversations at the end about um, not making the assumption like it's an aha moment for curriculum, and having discussions across grade levels, like between 8th and 9th, not making the assumption that teachers' kids come in with the same kind of exposure to various online platforms and how they are used. Because for us, the only difference, well, we didn't have any difference between 8th grade and 9th, but there was a slight change with online platforms. Well, you can't assume that the kids will come in having that. So how do you address that from the beginning?
Yes, yes. That's a great conversation moving from middle into high of what online platforms students have exposure to at the middle level, or that you may start introducing at the high school level and then supporting as they move into English 2 and beyond. Because, yes, every school, every classroom might be doing something different, pulling something different. So the backgrounds and the context might be a little bit different as well. Ooh, I see a response in the chat from Emily. Key takeaway was how C 9.1 provides context for effectiveness in AOR 5.3. And you are so right. And one of the things that we often talk about when we talk about, in this case, rhetoric, so C 5.1 is dealing with argument and rhetoric, is how even though it doesn't necessarily explicitly say it in C7 or C9, there are elements of rhetoric in both of those. When students are presenting information, they need to consider how they're going to structure their argument, and what appeals or types of reasoning or devices they might use. And then on the other end of that, with evaluating the arguments of others, considering those same choices or tools that speaker or presenter might use. So there is certainly that connection, and helps you to understand what may make an argument effective, how we might sort of define or delineate that effectiveness for sure. Are there any other takeaways? Maybe C8, did the C8 group have any takeaways in the needs, the guarantees, key terms, planning and instruction? Anything that you thought was helpful to share?
One thing that our group discussed with C8 was that a lot of times, and we talked about the article as well, where students need to know how to listen, like what listening feels like. And my partners reiterated how, since it's not assessed, as you said earlier, since it's not assessed, it's often overlooked, and it's very crucial that they understand that.
Absolutely. And I love what you pointed out with active listening, so that we're not just listening to respond, but we're listening to understand. And that is one thing, I don't know if that is something you've encountered at the high school level, but a lot of times teenagers are listening to respond and they're not listening to understand. And that responding and respectfully disagreeing with other perspectives or viewpoints is a part of the standard. So you have to be able to say, okay, I hear you. I see where you're coming from. I might not personally agree. But if you're just listening to respond, then you're not reaching that goal necessarily, which is important for life. Because I mean, you're going to work with people. You're going to be with people that you may not necessarily agree with or get along with, and you got to figure out how to collaborate and make that work. So.
Joy, I like your comments about active listening. You're right. Like, I'm here at the high school and I see it at all levels. Like, I was co-teaching with a teacher and we had 12th graders in there. And at one point I had to look at them and say, okay, no. I need you guys to really listen to what the people in your group are saying. So it's not something that's natural. And I think that sometimes we as teachers, I know I've been guilty of this too, just need reminders that maybe in the beginning of the semester, beginning of the year, throughout the year, you remind kids about how to do that.
Yeah, making it an intentional part of the instruction, because it may not come naturally. So yes, and making space for it. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let me get back on there. And so we talked about our example. I did want to share a few. Oh, am I not sharing my screen, y'all? I'm just sitting here chitty chatting away, not sharing anything. Okay, here we go. So our findings. So I did pull a couple of findings from my discussions with my team for each of these when we looked at the vertical progression, particularly at the high school level, some things that we thought were helpful to point out. First, there we go. Ooh, no, with C7. Let's see. All right. So C7, so communicating those ideas, presenting those ideas, includes the what, the why, and the how of presentation. So it's not just I'm getting up and I'm going to do a slideshow, but it is what am I presenting? What evidence do I have to support it? How am I presenting? So what choices do I make in terms of the format? What choices do I make in terms of my speaking technique? My body language that will work best for my audience, the task and the purpose. So all of that intentionality is there. And we see that in the writing as well at this level, right? If you came to our writing sessions, then you know intentionality of choices is all throughout communications. There's an emphasis in English 2 on credible evidence. English 1 and then back into 3 and 4, they talk about valid evidence or the validity of evidence. But there is a much more intentional focus in English 2 on credibility. And then we kind of fold that into the validity as they move into English 3 and 4. And in English 3, there is a focus on style. Which we know as in writing as well as students are progressing through the grade levels, they are emphasizing those stylistic choices and really that final polishing of the work. So we see that here in English 3 with students communicating their ideas. With C8, there is an emphasis in English 2 on clarifying ideas when students are having discussions with one another. So how do we clarify our ideas through speaking and listening? In English 3, there is an expectation to respectfully respond and respectfully disagree. Again, they are building those blocks all the way up to English 3, but explicitly being able to respectfully respond and respectfully disagree with others is a component of that indicator, and then that moves into English 4 as well. And then with C9, starting in English 1, there is an emphasis on identifying biases of the speaker. So there aren't any specific types of bias that are listed, but in the instructional resources that I will share with you, the lessons and strategies in just a moment, I'll give some examples to get you started. But identifying biases. Then in English 2 with C9, there is a plethora of new content or skills. There's a lot of bold in English 2. So we have style in English 2 for C9, the effectiveness and validity of information presented, and then logical fallacies. So biases will then bridge over into logical fallacies with English 2. And we do have logical fallacies defined in our glossary. Again, there's no one list of fallacies students need to know, but we have some examples listed in the glossary as a starting point for the instruction. And we have gotten a question in the past. We see style here in English 2, but we saw style with English 3 with C7 where they're presenting their ideas. So we've gotten the question, why are they talking about style in English 2 in one place and English 3 in another? And what we might want to consider here is they're looking at the style of others with C9. So they're identifying it and thinking about it in others' presentations before they're expected to intentionally use it in their own presentations. So that's why you might see it a grade level earlier in C9 versus C7. All right. So I know that was a lot of kind of looking at the individual indicator expectation with that deep dive. And now I want us to maybe put some of those expectations into action through some instructional practices. So we're going to look at some instruction, we're going to look at some ideas, and then have some collaboration time. Okay. So as we move into this discussion around instruction, we just want to remember the alignment of instruction always begins with the grade level indicators, right? So we are understanding the intent of those indicators for that particular grade level, and that helps us to then build our instruction. So we want our instruction to be aligned to the intent of the indicators. From there, that's going to help us determine how we will formatively assess our students' learning. And this is an iterative process. So we may use the formative assessment or feedback to determine which indicators we might need to revisit, or maybe even which instructional strategies we may need to adapt or revisit to support our learners, right? So always thinking from the grade level indicators first to then support the instruction and then the formative assessment. And this alignment is going to guide our work through this next section because we've already got that understanding of the grade level indicators. So in order to do that, I want us to circle back to that initial point about oral communication supporting reading and writing. So I'm going to share some information verbally to you and on this next slide. And as I do, I'm going to ask that you look at box 6 of your note catcher, which is going to have something called the 4A evaluation in it. So your 4 A's are going to stand for assumptions. So you're evaluating me as your speaker. So I want you to consider assumptions. What assumptions might I hold in this presentation? Agreements. What information do you agree with from the presentation? Arguments. What arguments are being made? Or what arguments might others make in response to my information? So if someone didn't agree with me, what might they say in response? And then lastly, assessments. So what is strong? What is missing? Or what are the implications of what you heard? So as I present, I want you to look at box 6 of your note catcher and try and jot down anything within those 4 A's. And afterwards, I'll ask you to maybe share one of those in the chat. Okay? Is everyone ready? All right. So we're going to start with, again, another quote, because y'all know I love a quote. This is from Cato the Elder. It says, "Grasp the subject, the words will follow." So Judith Hochman and Natalie Wexler's The Writing Revolution touches on the idea of students who are hesitant to write because they think they don't have anything to write about, or they don't have the knowledge to write about specific content. So they simply don't have the words to be able to write. This means that students need the opportunity to grapple with content and subjects that might be outside of their background knowledge through engagement with rigorous text. Having the opportunity to grapple with this content through oral communication not only builds language skills, but comfort around the content. This gives students both the language to write about these topics and confidence in their writing abilities. Oral communications are a support for writing, as well as a way to ensure mastery of concepts or skills that are acquired through reading. According to John Hattie's work with visible learning, classroom discussion has an effect size of 0.82, indicating that it has a significant positive impact on and can potentially accelerate student learning, well beyond the hinge point of 0.4. The written words follow the conversations and collaborations, or they accompany the presentation and evaluation of ideas. We can consider this structure in a similar way to how our world languages are taught in South Carolina through the model of integrated performance assessments. So students read and reflect, they communicate and reflect, and they write and reflect so that learning is formatively assessed and supported throughout the cycle. Okay, that was my little speech. I want us to go back to our 4 A's. So again, those were assumptions, agreements, arguments, or assessments. Take a moment to pick whichever of those and just drop one in the chat. What was an assumption that the speaker, aka I, held? What was something that maybe you agreed with? What was an argument that I made or that someone might make in response to my argument? Or what was an assessment? What was strong? What was missing? What are the implications? Let me go back to that one. Yeah. So go ahead and drop it in the chat. Assumptions. Students need to go beyond their comfort zone on topics by orally discussing them. Yeah. Oral communication supports writing. Yeah. So if they don't have that background and content knowledge, not only are they picking it up through the reading, but then they're having the discussion around it to support the writing. Have the conversation and the writing will follow. Mandy, yes. Assumption. Ooh, students will find words and opinions if they're actually introduced and grapple with the text. Sandra, I see you talk about productive struggle through the collaborative conversations. Yes, if we go straight from the reading into the writing and they don't have a chance to process it, we may not get the best end product. Yet reflection is important. Oh, assessments. Yes, discussing the effect size. Did anyone notice that I brought up John Hattie's effect sizes? Did I maybe assume that you knew what that was? If you've come to our webinars, you might have heard us talk about them, but I just mentioned it. I just brought up a piece of evidence that you might not have any context for. Yes. Yes, 0.82 effect size. Yep. And I mentioned the hinge point of 0.4, but again, if you haven't done any of that work, then you may not know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Let's see, agreement that students need to be exposed to and work with text outside of their background. Use all language skills, Vivian. Yes, read, write, listen, speak. That continuous cycle. All right, so let me go back here. Yep. This was our C9 correlation. So our 4A activity can be done to support C9, where you're evaluating and critiquing ideas interactively through listening and speaking. In this case, I was the guinea pig that you got to evaluate, but you may do this with any sort of presentation or any sort of speaker. All right. So we just discussed the idea that oral communications can support reading and writing. And I want us to think about how that applies specifically in the context of our standards. So on your note catcher, you will see that in box 7, I have the vertical progression for C1, which is argumentative writing, and then C7, which is presenting ideas or communicating ideas. And I've got the overall standard language here. But what I want you to do is take a minute, maybe pull those up and think about how those standards connect to and support one another. So they're both within the written and oral communication strand, but they are different expectations. But do we see any sort of similarities or connections between them? So take just a minute, pull them up. Maybe if you even look at one grade level across another grade level, do you see any similarities in the expectation? And feel free to drop those in the chat if anything comes up that you find to be particularly impactful or something that really draws your attention between argumentative writing and presenting or communicating ideas. And while you're doing that, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to pull it up. All right. So I've pulled up C1 and C7. Yeah, Crystal, you and I were on the same page there. Yes, I saw the emphasis on evidence in both. I can see that in both of these, this is student output of information. So in one case, they're writing an argumentative text. In another, they are presenting information. And that could be presenting a specific argument. And in either case, they're going to have to use evidence. Thank you, Belinda. Let's see. I'm looking at both and I'm seeing an emphasis on style. I see, let's see, intentional choices, right? Students are making decisions specific to a task, purpose, or audience. And that could be style. Are there any other connections that jump out to you? Or first off, do you see a connection between those two standards in some way, shape, or form? So this isn't just the case in C1 and C7. You may notice similarities between expectations across multiple standards, which is intentional, right? These are not meant to be taught in isolation, strand standards and indicators. And in this case, you're going to see similarities between the expectations for writing arguments and then presenting the ideas. And we get questions about this a lot. We get teachers saying, you know, these two indicators have similar language or expectation. Should I just teach one? Should I combine them? And when we see connections like this, when we see that there's similarity or emphasis on specific skills or content across multiple indicators, that becomes an opportunity to intentionally bundle in your instruction, right? So over a period of time, let's say we're working within a unit or a specific lesson, we can pull those things together intentionally. And as we've discussed and read, and had lots of conversation about already this morning, oral communications can be a way to support reading and writing. So in this next section, we are going to explore some resources and strategies for oral communications. And we're going to look at some lessons from your high quality instructional materials that are for reading and writing and talk about how we might use those strategies or use those oral communications to enhance the learning. So as we do that, we're going to think through the lens of two different lenses for instruction for C7, C8, and C9. Those are generative and evaluative experiences, and then micro, mini, and macro experiences. This is kind of how we're framing those examples in that work. So when we talk about generative experiences, we're talking about opportunities where students apply their learning through the creation of products that align with the skills or content from that instruction that they've received. So examples in this case might be presentations, might be class discussions, and then evaluative experiences would be the flip side of that, where students serve as the experts and they review work and provide targeted feedback, revisions, edits, or any sort of evaluation. So in this case, it might be video reviews, could be providing feedback to a speaker. So we've talked about generative and evaluative experiences in writing, but I want us to think about this in terms of oral communications, because each of those three oral communication standards fits somewhere within the generative and evaluative experiences, right? Um, so think about it in this way. Which of those three standards, C7, 8, or 9, would lend itself more naturally to a generative experience where students are creating something? Which of those three? Okay, so we can certainly make an argument for C8. We can also make an argument for C7. C7 is where they're presenting ideas. Yeah. What about evaluative, where they're looking at the work of others? That's your C9. Yes, absolutely. C8, though, really is a sweet spot because it's both, right? They're generating their responses in a discussion or collaboration, and they're evaluating the responses of others. So they're having to do both of those things in real time. I mean, that is cognitively demanding. So when we think about our standards for oral communications, they're going to lend themselves to both generative and evaluative experiences. We also think of our instruction in micro, mini, and macro experiences. And you may have heard these. We've talked about them with writing in the past. But micro, mini, and macro experiences, this is just terminology we use to refer to the depth or amount of time that an experience may take, right? So not everything necessarily needs to be the end of unit, big essay or big project. There is certainly a place for that, but we also provide that instruction through multiple exposures at different levels or different lengths. So in other words, in order to truly master concepts in C7, for example, students don't always have to write a big formal speech, right? There are lots of ways that they can demonstrate their mastery of C7. This also lets you hit sub-indicators within that overall standard through those micro and mini bursts. So when we talk about micro experiences, we're talking about experiences that are less than a class period, mini experiences being 1 to 2 class periods, and then macro experiences being that more culminating, larger experience. And what we really want is a balance of each of these things. When we look at the instructional examples in just a moment, I have added a micro, mini, macro for each of those standards. So C7 is going to have micro, mini, macro experiences, C8 is going to have them, and C9. So you have a little bit to kind of choose from and explore. So that's what we're going to jump into now. We're going to look at the resources for oral communications. And on your note catcher, box 8, you will see that you have a link to a folder. We can also drop it in the chat for you. But in the folder, you're going to see that there are 3 folders, one for C7, one for C8, one for C9. And within those, you're going to see sample strategies. So a micro, mini, and macro for each one. They are aligned to a high school grade level indicator. So maybe an English 1 for C7 micro, for example. But these are just to get you thinking. And as you explore those, you will have on your note catcher a place to jot down your thoughts. I would love for you to take, let's say, 6 minutes. We'll do about 6 minutes for you to take a look at those. Jot down any thinking in your note catcher. And when you come back just drop in the chat or verbally share just one of those resources that you thought might be helpful or might be relevant to your work or the work of the teachers who you support. So we'll loop back together, let's say 11:30, 11:39. Come back 11:39. Okay. And again, as you are looking through those example strategies for C7, 8, and 9, think about which of those might be most relevant or helpful, something that you might be able to take, use, or adapt, or even share with a colleague. If you scroll down to the bottom of each of those, there usually is a graphic organizer or some sort of resource there that you can access and use. So think about that, and I'll ask that you drop any examples in the chat that you think would be the most helpful for the work that you do. All right. So maybe go ahead and start dropping your responses in the chat. I see Crystal mentioned the 9-minute art or 9-minute ART. One that I really like, and one that I used in my classroom was Socratic Seminar. I mean, I didn't invent, obviously, Socratic Seminar. But one thing that I really liked as part of the graphic organizer for it is the planning for being in the inner circle, where students have a set of questions that they prepare beforehand, and those could be opening questions, core questions, or closing questions. And the reason that I really like that is because some students come to a Socratic seminar or a class discussion not really knowing where to join in on the conversation, or maybe are reluctant because they feel like they don't know how to come up with a question right on the spot. So being able to plan a variety of questions, it gives them lots of entry points into the discussion, and maybe makes them feel a little bit more comfortable coming to the table, ready to talk. Let's see, TED Talk. Yep, great way to incorporate multiple standards. And one thing that I did with the TED Talk is I have the TED Talk as a macro for C7, and then I have it as a micro for C9 for the audience. So if students are in the audience for their peers presenting their TED Talk, then there's a micro there where they can evaluate the presenter. So I've got a flip side for it. I see the conversation placemat. We actually did the conversation placemat, my team in a professional learning where we were participants, and we thought that was just really cool. So we adapted it for our needs. But yeah, that one was really cool with like talking chips or buttons. I see the purpose and bias jigsaw. Yes. Yes, understanding purpose, understanding bias can be really complex for students. So doing the jigsaw maybe makes it a little bit more manageable. And then I see the TED Talks again. Now, I have a ton more of these that I just haven't put in the folder. So that is something that I will continue to work on, but I wanted to make sure that you had a little something to get you thinking about how these indicators might be incorporated into some instruction, or if they're things you're already doing or things that you're planning on doing, now you might have a graphic organizer or a structure ready to go to help with it. So let me go back here to collaboration. Okay, so now that you have some resources, you have that understanding of the indicator intent, we want to go ahead and think about and practice using those resources or using that understanding of oral communications to bundle indicators and enhance some lessons that already exist. So we're going to do that through some sample lessons that I have pulled from your instructional materials. So I've pulled an English 1, 2, 3, and 4 lesson, and I've pulled them from each of the 3 adoptions. So HMH, McGraw-Hill, or Savas. And what I'm going to do is we're going to pop you back out into breakout rooms. You're going to be in an English 1, 2, 3, or 4 group. And in box 9 of your note catcher, you're going to have the samples to refer to. So there's going to be like a note catcher there where you'll look at the sample lesson that's provided. Think about the alignment of that lesson to the indicators. Now keep in mind that the lessons that I've given you are not oral communications lessons. They are reading or writing lessons or activities. What I want you to consider is how you might use an oral communications indicator to integrate into that lesson or enhance it, right? So how might we pull in presenting or communicating ideas, collaboration or discussion, or evaluating ideas within that lesson that already exists? And then lastly, as you're thinking about it, consider any of those resources that were in those folders that you might take and use within that lesson, okay? Mandy is going to pop you into a breakout room. So you'll either be in an English 1, 2, 3, or 4 breakout room. Okay. So I'll get these in the chat for you. And if need be, I can put them in your breakout room as well. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay. we'll do this pretty quick. So we'll only do about 10 minutes for this. Again, to work through whatever you can during that time, but keep in mind that you have access to all these documents. You can continue to work through them or do a deeper dive a little bit later on, okay? Now that was pretty quick to be able to look through your document. So I'm sure that you probably still have some more work to do around that. But just to make sure that we honor our time, I wanted to go ahead and pop us back in. Since you do have access to that document now, you will be able to go back and look at it. I'm also putting in the chat a folder that has all 4 of the documents. So the English 1, 2, 3, and 4, where you can make copies of those if you want to replicate this with your audience, and even pull out and adjust the sample lessons to align all with your instructional materials. Because you may have been looking at a lesson that was not from your textbook, but maybe you want to replicate this and do it with your textbook. So you will see in box 10 of your note catcher that there's just a little quick reflection just for you. We call it our compass reflection. It's just a way to kind of reflect on learning experiences from the day, maybe some next steps you might have, things that you might be excited about or might save later and come back to because you didn't get to do a full deep dive into them, or wonderings that you still have, like questions that you might still want to ask us. Because as you know, a 2-hour webinar is not enough time to become an expert in any one topic. It's just enough time for us to kind of briefly touch on the topics. So I'm sure there will be questions along the way, but we'll go ahead and wrap up with our clarity and closure. Let's see. Our purpose today, again, was to understand the content and rigor expectations for oral communications for high school students in order to develop and provide standards-based instruction using high-quality instructional materials and evidence-based strategies. So when you think about what you were hoping to be able to accomplish by the end of our time together today, do you think that you've been able to make progress towards that? When you wrote down at the beginning, here's what I think I'll be able to do. Do you think you have been able to get pretty close to it? Excellent. Okay. And maybe it's just a little step forward, but hopefully you were able to make some progress towards it. Excellent. Awesome.